The desert sun blazed mercilessly over the Johnson Space Center testing grounds in Houston, Texas. Dr. Sarah Chun wiped sweat from her forehead as she watched the sleek, metallic vehicle roll across the simulated lunar terrain. This wasn't just any car. This was humanity's next giant leap. The Lunar Terrain Vehicle, or LTV as everyone called it, looked nothing like the golf carts that Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin had driven across the moon's surface back in 1969. This machine was a beast of engineering brilliance, designed to survive the harshest environment known to mankind. Its carbon fiber body gleamed under the Texas heat, and its massive wheels, each one standing nearly 4 feet tall, crushed the artificial moon rocks beneath them with mechanical precision. Sarah had spent the last 7 years of her life working on this project. 7 years of sleepless nights, failed prototypes, budget hearings, and moments where she questioned whether they would ever get it right. But here it was, performing flawlessly during its final Earth-based trial run. How's the temperature regulation holding up? She called out to Marcus Webb, her lead engineer, who was monitoring the data from inside the mobile command center. Marcus's voice crackled through her headset. Steady at minus 200 degrees in the shaded compartments, 260 degrees on the sun-facing panels. The thermal management system is compensating perfectly. Sarah, I think we actually did it. A smile broke across her face. The moon was a place of extremes. During the lunar day, which lasted 2 Earth weeks, temperatures could soar to a blistering 260 degrees Fahrenheit. Then, during the equally long lunar night, they would plummet to minus 280 degrees. No ordinary vehicle could survive that punishment. The old Apollo rovers couldn't even last through a single lunar night. They were designed for short missions only, abandoned on the moon's surface when the astronauts returned home. But the LTV was different. It was designed to last for years, to carry astronauts across hundreds of miles of lunar terrain, to serve as a mobile base of operations for the Artemis program, NASA's ambitious plan to establish a permanent human presence on the moon. The stakes couldn't be higher. China had already landed their own rovers on the moon's far side. Russia was partnering with them to build a lunar research station. The new space race wasn't about planting flags anymore. It was about resources, scientific discovery, and securing humanity's foothold beyond Earth. Whoever controlled the moon's south pole, with its vast deposits of water ice hidden in permanently shadowed craters, would control the future of space exploration. That night, Sarah sat in her office staring at mission timelines spread across 3 monitors. Launch was scheduled for 8 months away. 8 months to finalize every system, to run every test, to prepare for every possible failure scenario. The weight of responsibility pressed down on her shoulders like a physical force. Her phone buzzed. It was a message from her daughter, Emma. "Mom, I told my class you're sending a car to the moon. My teacher didn't believe me. Can you send a picture?" Sarah's heart clenched. Emma was 9 years old. She barely remembered a time when her mother wasn't consumed by this project. How many school plays had Sarah missed? How many bedtime stories left unread? She typed back quickly, attaching a photo of the LTV, then stared at her daughter's smiling profile picture for a long moment before returning to her work. The months that followed were a blur of intensity. Every component of the LTV had to be perfect. The battery system, powered by solar panels that could tilt and track the sun, had to store enough energy to keep the vehicle alive through the freezing lunar nights. The navigation system had to work without GPS satellites, using star tracking and terrain mapping instead. The life support systems had to keep astronauts alive if they became stranded far from base. 3 months before launch, disaster struck. Sarah was in a review meeting when Marcus burst through the door, his face pale. "We have a problem. A serious problem." The wheel motors were failing, not in the dramatic, explosive way that made for good disaster movies, but in the quiet, insidious way that engineers feared most. Microscopic fractures in the motor housing, invisible to the naked eye, were appearing after extended cold exposure. On the moon, those fractures would spread. The motors would seize. The rover would die. How long to redesign? Demanded Gerald Hutchins, the program director, a gruff 60-year-old NASA veteran who had overseen more missions than Sarah had years of experience. 6 months minimum. Marcus said quietly. We need to change the alloy composition, run new tests, recertify everything. We don't have 6 months, Gerald said. His jaw was set in a hard line. We have 12 weeks until the launch window. If we miss it, the orbital mechanics don't align again for another year and a half. Congress is already questioning the budget. The Chinese are building their station right now. We cannot afford to wait. Sarah felt the room spinning. We can't launch with faulty motors. If those astronauts get stranded because of a failure we knew about, then fix it, Gerald interrupted. You have 12 weeks. Make it work. What followed was the most intense period of Sarah's career. Her team worked around the clock, testing new alloys, running simulation after simulation. They tried 17 different material compositions before finding one that held up to the thermal cycling. Then came the race to manufacture new motors, install them, and test them before the launch window closed. Sarah moved a cot into her office. She saw her daughter twice in 8 weeks, both times for rush dinners where Emma chattered about school, while Sarah's mind remained half-focused on motor specifications and test results. The guilt gnawed at her, but she pushed it down. After this mission, she promised herself, after this mission, she would make it up to Emma. With 3 days until launch, the final test results came back. The new motors were holding. Every system was green. The LTV was ready. The vehicle was packed into a specially designed cargo module aboard the Artemis 4 spacecraft. The launch would carry the rover along with supplies, equipment, and prefabricated habitat modules to the moon's south pole. The astronauts who would eventually drive it were already in training, learning every system, every emergency protocol. Launch day arrived with cloudless skies over Kennedy Space Center. Sarah stood in the viewing area with her team, Emma clutching her hand tightly. Hundreds of thousands of people lined the beaches and causeways, while millions more watched online. The massive Space Launch System rocket stood gleaming white against the blue Florida sky, more powerful than the Saturn V rockets that had carried the Apollo missions. Mom, are you scared? Sarah looked down at her daughter's upturned face. She thought about lying, about giving the brave, confident answer. Instead, she told the truth. Terrified. The countdown reached 0. For a moment, nothing happened. Then fire and smoke erupted from the base of the rocket, and with a roar that Sarah felt in her chest, the spacecraft began to rise. Faster and faster it climbed, arcing out over the Atlantic Ocean, carried with it years of work, billions of dollars, and the hopes of a generation. The first stage separated perfectly. The second stage fired. 15 minutes after launch, the Artemis 4 spacecraft was in Earth orbit, and Sarah could finally breathe again. But this was only the beginning. The spacecraft would spend 3 days traveling to the moon, performing a series of carefully choreographed engine burns to insert itself into lunar orbit. Then the cargo lander, a massive vehicle that looked like something from a science fiction film, would separate and begin descent to the lunar surface. Sarah barely slept during those 3 days. She monitored every telemetry update, every status report. The spacecraft performed flawlessly, and on day 4, the cargo lander fired its engines and began the terrifying descent. Landing on the moon was still one of the most dangerous moments in spaceflight. There was no atmosphere to slow the descent, no parachutes to deploy. Everything depended on rocket engines firing at precisely the right moments, on navigation systems calculating position to within centimeters, on fuel reserves lasting exactly long enough. Sarah watched the altitude numbers tick down on the mission control screens. 10 kilometers, 5 kilometers, 1 kilometer. The tension in the room was suffocating. She thought of the Challenger explosion, of Columbia breaking apart on re-entry, of all the missions that had ended in tragedy. Space was unforgiving. One mistake, one malfunction, and years of work would end in a crater of twisted metal. 500 meters, 100 meters, 50 meters. Contact light. The flight controller announced. The cargo lander had touched down. Cheers erupted through mission control, but Sarah remained frozen, waiting for confirmation that everything had survived the landing intact. All systems nominal. Cargo module secure. We have a successful landing. Now Sarah joined the celebration, hugging Marcus, shaking hands with Gerald. Feeling tears stream down her face. They had done it. The LTV was on the moon, but the mission was far from over. The cargo lander would now use its robotic arms to unpack the rover and deploy it onto the lunar surface. This process, practiced hundreds of times in simulation, would take 6 hours. Sarah returned home for the first time in days, crawling into bed next to her sleeping daughter, setting an alarm for 4 in the morning. When she returned to mission control in the pre-dawn darkness, the deployment was nearing completion. On the high-definition cameras mounted on the lander, she could see the LTV for the first time in its true environment. It sat on the lunar surface, its wheels creating the first tracks in virgin moon dust that had lain undisturbed for billions of years. The Earth hung in the black sky above it, a brilliant blue and white marble against the void. Remote systems checked, commanded the flight controller. One by one, the rover systems came online. Solar panels deployed and locked into position. Cameras activated, sending back crystal-clear images of the surrounding landscape. The nuclear battery, designed to provide power during the long lunar nights, hummed to life. Navigation systems initialized, mapping the surrounding terrain. All systems green. The LTV is fully operational. Another round of applause, but more subdued now. The real test would come when humans arrived. The Artemis 4 crew was scheduled to land 2 months later, and they would be the first to actually drive the rover across the lunar surface. Those 2 months passed in a strange state of suspended tension. The rover sat dormant, conserving power, waiting. Sarah continued monitoring its systems remotely, watching for any signs of degradation. The temperature fluctuations were even more extreme than predicted, but the thermal management system handled them perfectly. Solar panels tracked the slowly moving sun, gathering energy. Everything was holding. Then came the day when the Artemis 4 crew landed their spacecraft 2 kilometers from the rover's location. Commander Jake Morrison and mission specialist Dr. Lisa Park stepped out onto the lunar surface, and after securing their landing site, they made the walk to the LTV. Sarah watched the live feed as Jake approached the rover, his white spacesuit brilliant against the gray lunar landscape. "Houston, I've got eyes on our ride." His voice crackled over the radio. "She's a beauty." He climbed into the driver's seat, Lisa taking the passenger position. The interior of the rover was pressurized, meaning they could work without their bulky spacesuits once inside, though they kept them on for this first test drive. "Powering up," Jake announced. The rover's motors whirred to life, all systems showing green. "We are ready to drive." "You are go for test drive, Artemis." Mission Control responded. And then, for the first time, human hands guided Sarah's creation across the lunar surface. Jake pressed the accelerator, and the LTV rolled forward, its large wheels finding grip in the loose regolith. They started slowly, getting a feel for the vehicle, but soon they were cruising at 30 kilometers per hour across the ancient moonscape. "The handling is incredible," Lisa reported. "Terrain following working perfectly. Suspension compensating beautifully. This is nothing like the old Apollo rovers." For the next 2 hours, they put the LTV through its paces. They drove up crater slopes, tested the navigation system by driving to waypoints kilometers away, practiced emergency procedures. Every system performed exactly as designed. But the ultimate test came during their first extended mission. 5 days after landing, Jake and Lisa loaded the rover with scientific equipment and set out on a 3-day expedition to explore a series of craters at the lunar South Pole. These craters, permanently shadowed from the sun, had trapped water ice for billions of years. Understanding those resources was critical for future lunar bases. Sarah monitored their progress obsessively, the rover's position updated on her screen every few seconds as they drove deeper into terrain no human had ever seen. 20 kilometers from base. 50 kilometers, 100 kilometers. They were farther from safety than any astronauts since the Apollo era. On the second day of the expedition, crisis struck. Sarah was in a meeting when the alarm started blaring. She ran to mission control, her heart pounding. On the main screen, telemetry from the rover showed a critical error. One of the motor systems had thrown a fault code. "What happened?" she demanded. "Looks like they hit a boulder hidden under the regolith," the flight controller explained. Impact damaged the front right motor housing. Temperature regulation in that motor is failing. Sarah's blood ran cold. This was exactly the failure mode they had redesigned the motors to prevent. If that motor overheated during lunar day or froze during lunar night, it would seize. The rover would lose 25% of its mobility. Getting back to base would become exponentially harder. Where are they now? She asked. 75 kilometers from base, inside the Shackleton crater rim. 75 kilometers. 3 days of driving under normal circumstances. But with a damaged motor in some of the most treacherous terrain on the moon, Sarah ran simulations in her head, none of them good. Jake's voice came over the radio, calm despite the situation. Houston, we got the fault code. Assessing the situation now. Artemis, this is Houston. We're seeing the same data. What's your status? Motor's still functioning, but temperature is climbing. We're in shadow right now, which is buying us time. Recommend we head back immediately before the sun angle changes. Concur. Return to base best possible speed. Sarah pulled up the terrain maps. The route back would take them through areas that alternated between harsh sunlight and deep shadow. The damaged motor would be subjected to temperature swings that could destroy it at any moment. If it failed completely, they would have to abandon the rover and walk. 75 kilometers in spacesuits, carrying limited oxygen. They might not make it for the next 18 hours. Sarah didn't leave mission control. She tracked every kilometer of their return journey, monitoring the failing motor, calculating trajectory options, running worst-case scenarios. The motor temperature climbed steadily. 50 degrees, 100 degrees, 150. Houston, motor temperature is approaching critical, Lisa reported. Her voice was tight with stress. If this thing seizes while we're crossing the crater wall, we're going to have a real problem. Acknowledged, Artemis. Recommend reducing speed by 20% to lower thermal load. Jake slowed the rover. The temperature stabilized but didn't drop. They were in a race against physics itself. Every minute brought them closer to safety, but also closer to motor failure. 40 kilometers from base. 30 kilometers. The motor temperature hit 200 degrees, well beyond its design limits. Sarah could hear the stress in Jake's breathing over the radio as he carefully navigated the rover over boulder fields and across crater rims. 20 kilometers. The motor was approaching catastrophic failure temperature. Sarah stared at the numbers on her screen, willing them to hold just a little longer. Mom! She spun around. Emma was standing in the mission-controlled doorway, her grandmother beside her. Sarah had completely forgotten they were supposed to have dinner together. Not now, sweetheart, she said, turning back to the screens. Is something wrong? Emma asked, her voice small. Sarah hesitated. The room was silent, except for the quiet beeps of monitoring equipment and the occasional radio transmission. Then she made a decision. She walked over to her daughter and knelt down. The astronauts who are driving the car I made, she said quietly, they're in trouble. The car broke, and they're trying to get home. I need to help them. Emma's eyes went wide. Are they going to die? I'm going to do everything I can to make sure they don't. Emma nodded seriously. Okay, I'll wait. She took her grandmother's hand and sat down in chairs against the back wall. Sarah returned to her station, her daughter's presence somehow steadying her. She pulled up the motor specifications, looking for anything they had missed, any way to reduce the thermal load. Houston, Jake's voice crackled. Temperature just hit 220 degrees. Motor efficiency is dropping. I don't think we're going to make it. Sarah's mind raced. Then she had an idea. Jake, how much battery power do you have? 90%. Why? Shut down all non-essential systems. Life support, communications, everything except the motors and basic navigation. Redirect all available power to the thermal management system on that damaged motor. There was a pause. Houston, if we shut down life support and the motor fails anyway, we're stranded with no environmental control. I know, but if that motor fails right now, you're stranded anyway. This might buy you enough cooling to make it back. Another pause. Sarah could imagine the conversation happening in the rover, Jake and Lisa weighing the risks. All right, Houston. Shutting down secondary systems now. The telemetry feeds dropped to minimal data. Sarah could only track position and motor temperature now. The temperature began to drop. 215 degrees. 210. It was working 10 kilometers from base. 5 kilometers. Sarah could see base camp in the rover's forward camera now, the habitat modules and landing vehicles gleaming in the sunlight. 2 kilometers. 1 kilometer. The rover rolled into base camp with a motor temperature at 195 degrees, still dangerously high, but stable. Jake and Lisa climbed out, and even through their helmets, Sarah could see the relief on their faces. Houston, Artemis is home. And I am never complaining about traffic on the freeway again. Mission Control erupted in cheers and applause. Sarah felt her legs give out, and she sank into her chair, her body shaking with released tension. Emma ran over and threw her arms around her mother's neck. "You saved them," Emma whispered. Sarah held her daughter tight, tears streaming down her face. "We all did, baby. We all did." The investigation into motor failure revealed that a piece of debris, likely a micrometeorite that had struck the motor housing during deployment, had created a weak point that failed on impact with a boulder. It was a 1-in-a-million accident, the kind of thing that couldn't be fully prevented in the harsh lunar environment. NASA implemented new procedures for visual inspection of the rover after deployment, but otherwise, the LTV had performed magnificently, even under crisis conditions. Jake and Lisa completed their mission, and over the following months, the rover proved its worth again and again. It carried astronauts to distant craters, hauled scientific equipment across the lunar surface, and served as a mobile safe haven during solar flare events. The Chinese and Russians, watching NASA's success, accelerated their own lunar vehicle programs. The moon was becoming genuinely accessible for the first time in human history. A year after launch, Sarah stood on a stage in Washington, D.C., receiving the NASA Distinguished Service Medal. She gave a speech about the importance of persistence, about the teams of brilliant engineers who had made the mission possible, about the future of lunar exploration. But the moment that meant the most came afterward, in the hotel room, when Emma sat beside her and said, "Mom, my teacher wants to know if I want to be an astronaut when I grow up." "Do you?" Sarah asked. Emma shook her head. "No. I want to be an engineer like you. I want to build things that take people to amazing places." Sarah pulled her daughter close, looking out the hotel window at the moon rising over the Capitol building. Up there on that distant gray surface, her creation was waiting for the next team of explorers. And down here, her daughter was dreaming of building the vehicles that would take them even farther. The moon was just the beginning. Mars would come next, then the moons of Jupiter, then destinations that humanity hadn't even dreamed of yet. There would be failures and tragedies, triumphs and discoveries. It wouldn't be easy. It would never be easy. But that car on the moon, with its sturdy wheels and powerful motors and innovative systems, proved something essential. Humanity was no longer confined to Earth. The universe was vast and dangerous and filled with challenges that would test them in every way possible. And they were going anyway. Because that's what humans did. They built cars and sent them to the moon. They solved impossible problems and survived against incredible odds. They pushed forward into the unknown, driven by curiosity and courage, and the unshakable belief that the future was worth fighting for. Sarah Chun had helped build that future, one motor specification and thermal regulation system at a time. And watching her daughter sketch vehicle designs on hotel stationery, she knew that the work would continue, pass from one generation to the next, until humanity's reach extended to the stars themselves. The car on the moon was more than a machine. It was a promise, a statement, a declaration that no distance was too far, no challenge too great, no dream too bold for the species that had once gazed up at the moon and wondered what it would take to go there. But the real test was still to come. 3 months after the motor incident, Sarah was home for Emma's 10th birthday party when her phone rang. It was Gerald Hutchins, and his voice carried an urgency that made her blood run cold. "We have a situation. You need to get to Mission Control immediately." She made her excuses to Emma, promising to be back soon, and drove to the center faster than she should have. When she burst into Mission Control, the scene was chaos. Every screen showed red alerts, and the normally calm flight controllers were talking rapidly into their headsets. "What's happening?" Sarah demanded. Gerald turned to her, his face drawn. "Solar flare. Massive one. Hit the moon 40 minutes ago. The Artemis V crew was out on an extended expedition when it struck. They're 130 kilometers from base, and their habitat module took damage. Life support is failing." Sarah's stomach dropped. "How long do they have?" 6 hours of oxygen. Maybe 8 if they go into minimal activity mode. Can they walk back? Not in time. Not carrying enough oxygen. Sarah, the only way to get them back is the rover. But here's the problem. He pulled up a thermal map on the screen. The solar flare superheated the surface. Temperatures in sunlight are hitting 320 degrees Fahrenheit. That's 60 degrees above what we designed the LTV to handle. Sarah stared at the numbers. At 320 degrees, the rover's seals would fail. The battery system would overheat. The motors would burn out. The vehicle would die long before reaching the stranded astronauts. "Who's on the crew?" she asked quietly. "Commander Jennifer Wolfe and Specialist David Park." David Park, Lisa's husband. They had a 5-year-old daughter. "We need options," Gerald said. "Chinese have a rover in the region, but it's too small to carry 2 people and doesn't have life support. Russians are offering rescue support, but their nearest asset is 4 days away. Sarah, if we're going to save them, it has to be with the LTV." She closed her eyes, her mind racing through every system specification, every thermal calculation she had ever run. The rover couldn't survive 320 degrees. It was physically impossible with the current configuration. Or was it? "The solar panels," she said suddenly. "They're designed to tilt away from the sun during peak heat. What if we invert that function?" Marcus looked up from his console. "You mean point them directly at the sun?" "Sarah, that would make the heat problem worse." "No, we don't point them at the sun. We angle them to create shade. The panels are already reflective to maximize efficiency. If we position them to reflect sunlight away from the critical components, we could create a thermal shield. The panels themselves might get damaged, but the motors and battery might survive long enough." "Might isn't good enough," Gerald said. "If that rover dies halfway there, we've lost any chance of rescue." "It's the only chance we have," Sarah shot back. "We can do this remotely. I can reprogram the solar panel positioning system from here. We run the rover hard and fast, sacrifice the panels to protect the vital systems." Gerald looked at the mission clock. 5.5 hours of oxygen left. Time to target is 4 hours at maximum speed. That gives us 30 minutes of margin for error. 30 minutes. Then we start now. The next 20 minutes were a blur as Sarah accessed the rover systems remotely. Her fingers flew across the keyboard, rewriting control algorithms that she had spent months perfecting. She was essentially turning the solar panels into a parasol, using them to shield the rover from the killing heat. "Upload complete," she announced. "Someone needs to drive it." "I'll do it," said a voice from the doorway. Everyone turned. Commander Jake Morrison stood there in his flight suit, having just returned from a training exercise. "I've driven that rover more than anyone. I know what she can do. Patch me in remotely." "Jake, you'll be controlling it from 250,000 miles away with a 3-second communications delay," Marcus protested. "One wrong move and you'll flip it." "Then I won't make a wrong move." Gerald nodded. "Do it." "Jake, you're driving." They established a remote link, and Jake sat down at the control station. On the main screen, the view from the rover's forward camera showed the scorched lunar landscape, shimmering with heat distortion. "Powering up," Jake said. His hands moved over the controls with practiced precision. Solar panels repositioning to thermal shield configuration. Temperature readings are climbing fast. 300 degrees on the motor housings. "Stay below 320, Sarah urged. "That's the critical threshold." The rover began to move, accelerating quickly across the lunar surface. Jake drove with absolute concentration, his eyes flicking between the terrain map and the temperature readouts. Every few seconds, the 3-second delay made the controls lag slightly. turning what should have been smooth driving into a constant anticipation game. 20 kilometers out, 30 kilometers. The motor temperatures climbed. 305 degrees. 310. Come on, Sarah whispered. Hold together. 50 kilometers. The rover crested a crater rim, and Jake had to navigate a steep descent on the far side. With the communications delay, he had to predict the terrain before he could see it, trusting the pre-map data. Front left motor just hit 315, Marcus called out. We're approaching critical. I see it, Jake said through gritted teeth. Reducing speed by 10%. Negative, Gerald barked. Keep speed up. We're on a timeline. That motor can either fail now or fail after we've reached them. Choose after. Jake pushed the accelerator forward again. The temperature hit 318 degrees. 70 kilometers. 90 kilometers. The rover was holding, but Sarah could see stress fractures forming in the data. Battery efficiency was dropping. Motor output was fluctuating. The vehicle was dying by degrees under the merciless heat. 100 kilometers, Jake announced, I have visual on their habitat. On screen, Sarah could see the damaged module in the distance, its white surface scorched and torn. Two figures in spacesuits stood beside it, waving their arms. Jennifer, David, this is Jake. I'm coming in hot. Literally. Get ready to board the moment I stop. Copy that. Jennifer's voice came back. We're down to 40 minutes of oxygen. Whatever you're doing, do it fast. Jake brought the rover in at full speed, braking hard at the last moment. The wheels threw up a cloud of lunar dust that took several seconds to settle in the low gravity. The motor temperatures had hit 322 degrees. Red alerts were flashing across every system. Board now, Jake shouted. Through the rover's cameras, they watched Jennifer and David climb onto the vehicle, securing themselves to the external handholds. There wasn't time to pressurize the cabin and get them inside safely. They would have to ride outside, hanging on for the most dangerous drive in lunar history. Secure, Jennifer confirmed. Get us home. Jake threw the rover into reverse, spinning around and accelerated back toward base. The motor temperatures were climbing past 325 degrees now, well into catastrophic failure range. Warning alarms blared in mission control. Front left motor efficiency at 60%, Marcus reported. Front right at 70%. Sarah, she's not going to make it. She'll make it, Sarah said with a conviction she didn't feel. She has to. 10 kilometers from base, the front left motor seized. The rover lurched violently to one side, nearly throwing Jennifer and David off. Jake compensated instantly, redistributing power to the remaining three motors. The vehicle limped forward, slower now, unbalanced. Come on, baby, Jake muttered. Just a little farther. 5 kilometers. The battery system was overheating, shedding power at an alarming rate. 3 kilometers. The front right motor began making grinding noises audible even through the vacuum of space, transmitted to the rover's frame. Battery at 15%, Marcus said. Not enough to make it back. Sarah's mind raced. Jake, shut down all thermal management. Redirect everything to the motors. We don't need the rover to survive. We just needed to get them home. If I do that, the whole system will burn out. I know. Do it anyway. Jake didn't hesitate. He killed the thermal management system, and immediately all available power flowed to the motors. The rover surged forward with a last burst of speed. Temperature alarms screamed. Systems failed, cascading across the board. 2 kilometers. 1 kilometer. Base camp appeared on the horizon. The rover rolled to the base camp entrance, with smoke literally pouring from its motor housings. Battery at 0%. Running on nothing but momentum. It coasted to the stop 50 meters from the habitat module, and Jennifer and David jumped off, running for the airlock. The rover systems went dark. All of them. The vehicle that had carried astronauts across hundreds of kilometers of lunar terrain, that had survived impossible conditions and performed miracles of engineering, finally died. Sarah watched the telemetry flatline and felt tears streaming down her face. Jennifer and David were safe. That was what mattered, but her rover, her beautiful, incredible machine, was gone. "We did it," Gerald said quietly. "Sarah, we did it." Jake slumped back in his chair, exhausted. "That was the most intense 4 hours of my life. And I've been to the moon." The room erupted in cheers, people hugging, crying, celebrating. But Sarah just stared at the dark screen where the rover systems had been. Marcus put a hand on her shoulder. "She went out a hero. That machine saved 2 lives today." Not many vehicles can say that. Over the next days, the story spread around the world. The Lunar Terrain Vehicle's final mission became legendary. News outlets called it the most dramatic rescue in space history. Jennifer and David gave emotional interviews about watching the rover approach through the shimmering heat, about the desperate ride back to base, about the smoke rising from the failing motors as they jumped to safety. But for Sarah, the victory fell hollow. She had spent 7 years building that rover, and it had lasted less than 18 months on the lunar surface. When she finally made it home, 3 days after the rescue, Emma was waiting up despite the late hour. "Everyone at school is talking about your car," Emma said excitedly. "They said it saved those astronauts' lives. They said it was the bravest car in the world." Sarah tried to smile. "It was a good car." "It's gone, sweetheart. It broke during the rescue. We can't fix it." Emma was quiet for a moment. Then she said something that would stay with Sarah for the rest of her life. "Maybe that's what heroes do, Mom. They give everything they have to save people. Your car was a hero, and so are you." 6 months later, Sarah stood in the viewing area at Kennedy Space Center again, Emma beside her. On the launch pad stood another rocket, another cargo payload. Inside was LTV-2, built with all the lessons learned from its predecessor: improved thermal management, redundant motor systems, enhanced battery capacity. It would serve the Artemis program for years to come. But before the new rover launched, NASA had done something unprecedented. They sent a small robotic mission to the abandoned LTV-1, still sitting dead in the lunar dust where it had made its final stand. The robot planted a commemorative plaque beside it, with an inscription that Sarah had written herself. "Here rests the Lunar Terrain Vehicle, first of its name. In its brief life, it carried explorers across alien landscapes, survived impossible conditions, and gave everything in the service of human life. It proved that the machines we build can be more than tools. They can be partners in humanity's greatest adventures. May its sacrifice never be forgotten. The old rover will remain there forever, a monument in the lunar dust. Future astronauts would pass it on their journeys, and they would remember the day a car on the moon became a legend." As the rocket ignited and the new rover began its journey to replace its fallen predecessor, Emma squeezed her mother's hand. "Mom, when I build my Mars rover someday, I'm going to make it just as brave as yours." Sarah pulled her daughter close, watching the rocket arc into the sky. "I know you will, baby. I know you will." The future of space exploration stretched out before them, full of challenges and triumphs yet to come. There would be more rovers, more missions, more moments of terror and joy. Humanity was writing its story across the solar system, one machine at a time. And it all started with a car on the moon that refused to quit, even when quitting would have been easier. That kept going when every system screamed for it to stop. That gave its last breath of power to bring its crew home safe. They had sent a car to the moon, and that car had taught them something profound. That the greatest achievements come not from machines that never fail, but from machines and people who push beyond their limits when it matters most. The new rover would be better, stronger, smarter, but it would always exist in the shadow of the one that came before, the one that set the standard for what it meant to serve humanity in the harshest environment imaginable. LTV-1 was gone, but its legacy would roll across the lunar surface for generations to come, carried forward by every vehicle that followed in its tracks, by every engineer who learned from its example, by every mission that dared to push the boundaries of what was possible. The car on the moon had become immortal, not in function, but in memory, not in its systems, but in its spirit, and that spirit would never die.